Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of Race, Wealth, and Health. As always, I am so excited for our guest today, Dr. L. Brown. Elated to have you on. Dr. Brown is the founder and CEO of KinderJam, which she's going to tell us a lot more about. But so excited to have you on, fellow Rattler and friend.
Boom. So excited to be here. I cannot wait to get into this discussion.
Yes. And so my favorite thing is to tell people how we met. And so we are both a product of the Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. But oddly enough, we did not meet on campus. We met through a trip. I mean, so rattlers are everywhere. And I'm sure that should be a hashtag somewhere, right? And so there was this big trip. What was it, like 50 of us?
70. Yeah, about 7 of
Okay.
them.
There was a big trip to go to Kenya specifically, and it was just a bunch of rattlers and friends of rattlers. That's how I feel like it was. And was it maybe like a week or something? But either way, I met like a bunch of rattlers that I didn't know when I was actually on campus. Dr. L was one of them. And I think we just stay connected. Like I follow your
Mhm.
story. First of all, let me just say, anyone who doesn't follow her, like just your ability to write the most interesting and captivating Facebook posts that I actually read. You know, people love to be in comments and be like, "Who's reading all that?" And I'm usually like, "Yeah, I'm just scrolling and reading."
Wow.
Has been wonderful. And then I remember you started your doctoral journey, and when I made the decision, you were so gracious enough to have a conversation with me as I was thinking about starting my journey as well. And here we are, both on the back end of that part of that journey. We both survived and triumphed through the doctoral process. And so I'm just so excited to have you come and chat about the work that you're doing, especially with KinderJam, because I think that's something I love to hear about. And then even some of the more recent personal work that you've been working on.
Boom thing.
But yeah, as we get into that, if you wouldn't mind just kind of telling our listeners a little bit, like, what is KinderJam and how did you get into that work?
Boom. Well, KinderJam is an early childhood and family engagement solutions organization. So essentially, I work with agencies who work with young children and their families to help them create solutions. Those solutions could look like building teams for them for projects, it could be training, it could be consulting, whatever is the space that allow people who are not like each other to work together to move children and family forward. That's where I come in. So with KinderJam, it really went through a metamorphosis. It's a complete evolution starting from my living room and the things that I needed as a stay-at-home mom at the time. My son is an individual on the autism spectrum. Back when I think that's 2008, he was about 17 months old, and I started to notice developmental delays, characteristics of developmental delays, and I took him to the pediatrician.
Mhm.
And the pediatrician did not readily see the things that I saw. And after I'd given him, like, "Oh, I feel, and can you help me?" And I'm going through this emotional, confessional to this pediatrician, telling him there are things that I really feel need to be looked at. And he gives my baby a well baby visit. He looks at his eyes, his ears, his nose, and heart, and he says, "Good job, mom." And he
Right.
gives me a sticker and he sends me on my way. And so when I got to the car, I felt a lot of emotions actually. I felt one, I was embarrassed that I had been intimidated in the office because I
Mm.
know I went in there feeling and thinking certain things, and I then felt disregarded, and I made myself small. So when I got in the car, not only was I embarrassed about that, I was angry about that, I was frustrated. And so I was like, okay, what would I do if I were in the classroom? Because I'm a teacher by trade at the time, but I was a stay-at-home mom. And I said I would teach, evaluate, assess, and refer. That's what we would do if I was in the learning environment and I saw something that gave me cause for concern. So I
Mhm.
didn't have an infrastructure at home, so I created it. And my son had a natural inclination to music, and all children, for the most part, love tactile activities, touch, feel. So I started doing music and movement activities with them, because one of the things about my baby then, I could communicate with him via song, even though he did not yet have language skill. And so after probably about 3 weeks to a month of doing that, I used that to collect data points. And I took those data points back to the pediatrician. And then I spoke from a place of logic as opposed to emotion. This is what I've noticed. These are the things that he does well. These are the things that he needs improvement with. And I believe that I need a referral to a speech pathologist. If I get that referral and the speech pathologist feels that there's nothing that we should be concerned about, then I'll let it go for now.
Mhm.
I get the referral, we get to the speech pathologist, and we find out there is a delay in language.
Mhm.
With that, that begins our dance with service providers. So in that particular dance, I was working with some things on the inside where I had this thing with authority. So these people were in these authoritative positions and they were supposed
Mhm.
to know. But yet I had
Mhm.
this baby and I was responsible for knowing for him. My voice as a mom had not yet developed. So after some years of going back and forth with service providers, I reached out to a friend who had a son when I taught in Japan. So when I talked in Japan, her son was like 11. And in my brain and in my heart, I felt like Ricky too would look like Shannon when he turned 11. So I called this former colleague who happened to be a mentor of mine and said, I think Ricky too is like Shannon. And Shannon did not have an autism diagnosis. It was not otherwise specified because he was much older. Autism wasn't as acknowledged then.
Right.
So she told me to call the nearest teaching hospital. So that was Stanford University because we happen to be in California.
Okay.
And on the parking lot in Macy's, at the mall, I called them and I said, "Hello, my name is Elle Brown, and I need somebody to put eyes on my baby."
Mm.
And they were the first people who heard me. So we went through the process of getting the evaluations. We go in and we have a behavioral assessment done at 4 years, 5 months. And the first time I took him to a pediatrician's office, he was 17 months old. So at 4 years, 5 months, my baby received the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And I was over the moon excited because now finally, it was almost validating for me because I felt as though I was heard. And one of
Yeah.
the things that got me is that we now, in looking back from a reflective space, I have to understand that and give myself grace because I now understand all of the players. So I was walking in saying, "This is my baby, help me." People were looking at him saying, "Well, he's doing fine," but they didn't know me. They didn't know what I was doing with my son. That
Mhm.
I was the gun ho mom. Every day we were doing these learning experiences. And what I was noticing while what they were looking at him and whatever barometer they were using to measure him was different than what I had.
Yeah.
I was saying for the amount of input I'm giving this child, there should be a huge output. He should be splitting atoms by now. Oh, with that, I then came to understand that one, every family is different.
Mhm.
And two, parents need to know how to communicate about their children. And I was in a military community at the time.
Okay.
So KinderJam actually started out as what I did on my living room floor with my son. And then I started doing it in military communities for other families so that it was a large stay-at-home mom population. So that they would then understand how their babies learned and grew and they would have deliberate practice in articulating those things. Prior to becoming a military spouse, I was a DoD teacher overseas. And so I understood that military families move from place to place. So they don't have the continuity of care that some
Yeah.
families who have, maybe in the same school pyramid from K through 12. So you really have to be skilled and versed in advocating for your child when they're changing schools every 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
From there, parents became really interested in the program because many of the stay-at-home moms were teachers by trades, and we weren't in a market for a job. So they were like, if you package it up, we'll teach it at the next location. And the first locations were Pigeon, Michigan and Misawa, Japan. And then from there, it just Johnny Appleseeded through word of mom and the military spouse and State Department communities. And we grew to service families in 11 countries and 16 states. And that
Wow.
was the story of KinderJam.
Yeah.
And then when I got here, I'm now in the DC metro area. When I got here, when my life was going through a transition and I reclaimed my independence, I decided to take KinderJam, which was a licensing program, and I decided to hire staff and then procure government contracts and then send individuals out to teach with my curriculum. And from there, it just grew to training and preschools and camps, all the things that we do now.
Wow, that is amazing. One, I didn't realize you were in so many different locations. And one of the things that you touched on early, but I think answered for our listeners, which was as you were talking about your journey with Ricky too, because I've also followed all of the lovely acronyms that we have for him now. I think he's SDYM now.
Correct, super duper young man.
Yes. But in talking to the pediatrician the first time around 17 months with Ricky too, and you were mentioning all the things that you were doing. And so what you highlighted is that your background was at being a teacher, right?
Mhm,
So that's important to know. So that was naturally and innate in you. And so you were working as a stay-at-home mom saying, okay, I've done this for other people's children. So obviously
absolutely.
you're gonna do it for your own. But then the other thing that you highlighted in that story that I don't want to miss either is how you learn to advocate for yourself, but the experience that people of color typically have when it comes to medical providers
Yeah,
and not feeling and being heard, and it's across it doesn't matter if it's a pediatrician, whether it's the gynecologist, like, it just we see it, and we see it in the results. I had a friend on a prior podcast from
mhm,
the public health space and talking about the health disparities among
mhm.
women and specifically Black women, and so we hear this all the time, right? Like, the way that we are medical professionals in care and acknowledgement of our concerns.
Boom. See, a lot of my trainings that I currently offer right now are in the space of cultural humility
Mm,
for that reason. Cultural humility is an approach to working with individuals that you're offering services to. It started in the medical profession to understand that in order to give someone relevant care and service, you have to step outside of yourself and become a student of the other person. The service providers asked me some particular questions during the time, they could have unearthed some things about the context of our environment and therefore better understood that, yes, there's some merit to what she's saying because of what she is doing, thinking, and feeling. However, they go in sometimes as professionals and we think that we have the content knowledge and we just go and we give based on our content knowledge. And that's when
yeah,
you start getting things like cultural competence, which is more of an academic construct. You read it in a book, you studied it in a class, you've learned it in a workshop. So now you're applying it to a human. However, when you think about cultural competence, it's more for a large body of people to understand trends and to understand a phenomenon or a population. Whereas with cultural humility, it's about this woman who's in front of me right now. What does she need? How do
mhm,
I best serve her? So now I travel and I train largely on engagement, and cultural humility is a large part of that because I'm now, because of the things that I went through, I was like, well,
mhm,
if I'm a service provider by trade, I speak the language and I still went years being unheard. What might someone without that skill set experience? So I go in where it's not as organized to talk to every parent, but I can go into organizations and talk to service providers.
yeah. And that's huge, and that's super important. One, kudos for doing that, right? Like that providing that kind of, feedback and information is important. And then the other thing that you touched on in talking about being able to provide that feedback, when you were telling the story, you mentioned this idea of authority,
Mhm,
right? And I know we're both from Florida, or Southern-ish, depends,
mhm,
Florida's an interesting state. It could be kind of the South, it could be a lot of different things, but we still have that kind of Southern thoughtfulness around,
mhm.
like you said, humility, around respecting of authority, and so, yeah, tell me how you unpack that for yourself, 'cause
Ooh,
obviously that's a very ingrained in upbringing,
mhm.
home training, right, in terms of how we interact with
Mhm.
individuals in authority.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. So let's break it down into pieces. So the first part of it had a lot to do with how I came up. And it's not necessarily about the things that I was taught explicitly. I grew up well below the poverty line and I didn't necessarily have the supports that my son has. So someone amplifying my voice from young. So while on the outside I looked the part, on the inside, I didn't yet feel the part. So
Mhm.
therefore, when I spoke, I was often very cautious in certain spaces because I was thinking, if I misconjugate my nouns and my verbs, or if I say things a certain way, that might speak to intellect and I wouldn't be taken as seriously. Because in marrying the way I did to whom I married, I placed myself in a different social economic space. So now I was around people who did not mirror the population which I was most accustomed to growing up. So even with that, it made me a little uncomfortable at the time because I had not grown to be the woman that I know myself to be now. So
Mhm.
that was there. So there was some inferiority, feelings of inferiority that were already there. Then when you think about being a new mother, one of the things, no matter how intelligent one might be, motherhood is an institution. And it's an institution that other people gauge based on whatever they believe good mothers are, good mothers aren't. And I had not yet come to understand that my mothering journey is my mothering journey. It belongs to me.
Mhm.
So with that, I didn't necessarily know if I wanted to be a good mother. I just didn't want to be seen as a bad mother. I didn't want to be a bad mother.
Mhm.
Um, when you throw things like my upbringing, then you factor in this institution of motherhood, and then I have to bring race in. I was in Central Coast, California. There was a lot of people who looked like me, and I was trying to play the role. So in my not trying to rock the boat, I wasn't heard.
Mhm.
And one of the reason why I say it was a lot to unpack, because I ended up doing a lot. I ended up going back and getting a master's degree and eventually going back and getting a PhD so that I could be able to communicate in spaces using logic. So now I'm able to operate void of emotion. Even though I feel them, I'm able to operate above them because I'm quite skilled in that area. And so one thing that I've come to understand that regardless of who's in the room, logic is always boss. Because
Mhm.
any reasonable person in the room can follow succinct logic. So that helped me a lot. But that authority is really big when you're flying on the seat of your pants and you have all of these biases from your upbringing. And it interfered with my effectiveness early on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so again, you founded KinderJam, you did these amazing things. You also wrote a book,
Yeah,
right?
well, I've written several books.
Several
So
books. Yes. Please correct me. Yes, several books. Tell us a little bit about what are some of the things that you've written thus far.
okay, so what my first book was after I reclaimed my independence from my marriage. I went on a journey to reintroduce myself to myself,
Mhm.
and that involved losing 100 pounds in 274 days, and I chronicled it. So I just happened to be Army Spouse of the Year during that time, and yet I left a marriage while Army Spouse of the Year. So I was Army Spouse of the Year, and like military.com reached out to me to write an article, and it was like 26 tips to, losing weight and finding your better you. And because it was such a huge response from the article, I chose to expand the article into a book. So that was my first book. Then I did like a journal memoir of my journey as the mother of a child on the autism spectrum.
Mhm.
And that was Mama Bear, because that's my alter ego, Mama Bear. She not only is an advocate for her cub, but for other cubs and families.
Mhm.
Then the third book was a book that I wrote with my son, and it is a children's book. And so with that, it's about facilitating inclusive play. So it's called Friendship Numbers. It was a song that I wrote for him that we used in Jam because he had some issues in kindergarten camp in making friends. And I was like, how can I give back? So I created this song showing there was room for everyone in friendship. And then we decided to turn this song into a book, and he wrote all of the graphic art part, the speech bubbles, and I wrote the text. It's a number sense book. And then my most recent book was last year, and it's You Are Not Alone. And it's a blueprint for mothers who are parenting children on the autism spectrum.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, like, I love that. So, let's kinda back up to a little bit around the career journey. So you started KinderJam, I know you mentioned now, and there may be some things that we may have missed in that space because now you're also doing consulting for service providers, as it relates to cultural humility,
Mhm.
based on your experiences. And so any kind of work and transition in between those 2 things that you wanna highlight? I know we had a whole pandemic and there's some
Right.
things and shifts that happened in that space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know what? God makes no mistakes. So Kinder Jam, I like prior to the pandemic, I felt like I had to have this really complicated, complex, flashy definition for what Kinder Jam is.
Mhm.
because everybody else seemed to have all these titles. And I own my own company, but it really was, in my mind, the brainchild, of necessity. And then it just grew into something. So I really didn't give KinderJam the credit that it deserved. And by that, I didn't give God the credit that he deserved.
Mm,
However, when the pandemic happened, it literally was like overnight, I saw my company begin to dissolve. At that point, we had classes, we had camps, we had a preschool, and I was also doing speaking and training, much like what I'm doing now. I just do a little more of each of those things. Well, when the pandemic occurred, overnight, everything was just gone.
yeah.
And then I realized that I was in the people business, and if people weren't around, I really didn't have a business. And, the only thing that continued was I was working at a university at the time, so I was able to do that via Zoom. So, however, for the living that I had, the cost of living that I was on salary with my company for about 10 months. And after about 10 months, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm my biggest bill. So there's no way that I can really justify continuing to be my company's biggest bill when I didn't have the revenue coming in that allowed me to pay myself and continue to grow. So I decided to dust off my teaching certificate and go back into the classroom. It was in a virtual space. So at that point, it really worked for me because I had a son who was in middle school. So I said, oh, this is fine. I'll teach school from my computer in my living room. I will, go ahead and make his lunch so I can be mom and teacher at the same time. Well, not too long after that, the schools opened back up, but I was still cool because I was like, they were asking me, you only work like 4 days a week, and they only wanted me to come into the school 2 days a week. And okay. And I was off by two. So I was like, this works. And this was 2021. So
Okay.
now we're like in April, May of 2021. And it really, at that point, we think the world's about to open up, but we're really not sure.
Sure. Yeah.
So when time came to make a decision on what I was going to do, because they brought me in at the end of the school year, so I wasn't there for the entire school year.
Okay.
So I was like, okay, what am I going to do? Do I risk it and just kind of hope the world opens up between now and September, or do I go ahead and take this job for this full school year because I don't know when this thing is going to be over?
Mhm.
So I decided to take a job for that school year, and it was a blessing and a curse. That's the only way
Mhm.
and I absolutely positively love teachers. I work with them for a living. With that being said, I had spent quite a bit of time as an entrepreneur. By that time, I'd been without a job for 17 years. So I'd gone 17 years without an employer.
Yeah.
And the virtual school didn't really I didn't feel like I was employed. It felt very much like entrepreneurship. I was operating from my home. I did go in twice a week, for the last few weeks, but it still didn't feel real.
Mhm.
However, when time came for me to go in 5 days a week, and I remember that the principal, when asking me, was I sure that I was up for a full year? She says, well, it's a full school year. We go to school 5 days a week, and our day is till 4 o'clock instead of 2 o'clock. And I had romanticized work conditions. Where I get in there, and week one, it still feels like wonderful to me because I actually ended my career teaching without knowing that that was my last year teaching, because my ex-husband was in the military and he was going to be redeployed to Colorado instead of Korea, where I was working at the time. So I resigned from my job pretty impulsively, and I didn't teach again after that, and I didn't know that that would be my last year teaching. So part of me was like, it was nostalgic. I was like, "Oh my goodness, Sharpie markers smell so good. All these babies coming to my classroom, rainbow colors everywhere." And I was like, "Wait a minute, I gotta do this every day?" Like,
Right. Now,
ever
what grade were you teaching?
second grade. And it's my absolute favorite grade in the whole wide world. It's the kicker. What I did not realize is that I absolutely, positively love teaching. I absolutely, positively loved engaging with children. what I forgotten about was work relationships.
Mm.
That
Mhm.
not everyone there wants to be there for whatever reasons. And with me, I had this buffer around me because I knew it was only for 1 year. But there are some people who are there who have more month than money. There are some people who are there who no longer want to be there. There are some people there who've been passed up for promotions. There are some people there who want to be other places, but their bills won't allow them to make the leap. And then you put them all in a building together and doesn't make for the most pleasant work environment.
Mm.
And while there, I came up with this saying that work shouldn't hurt. And that's why I say the blessing, the curse came because I saw a side of education that I had forgotten that it existed.
Yeah.
The blessing was I saw a side of education that I had forgotten existed. And
Mhm.
it then positioned me to not only work in family engagement where I always work, but now I also offer team engagement. So all of my workshops are on family or team engagement. How do we work together with people who are not like us, that we are under the umbrella of a common mission to move children forward? And had I not been in that work environment, I would still be somewhere pushing sunshine, unicorns, and rainbows to people who were operating in real life. And they were probably side eyeing me like, girl, whatever.
Right.
Now I can come from a place of real where I say, I get it. I understand. Now, let's see, how do we make this better for everyone? Because I now understand that, even with my own teacher from my preschool, it allowed me to see them differently.
Yeah.
Whereas I used to see employees as liabilities because they're bills. I have to pay insurance for them. I have to pay
Mhm.
payroll for them. If
Yep.
they are bills. But now I get what a human resource and a human asset actually is. That is someone who is getting out of their bed, coming to my place of business to move my agenda and mission forward and
Yeah.
help sustain my living. And they deserve to be treated with respect. They deserve to have work conditions that feel good to them. They're getting out of their warm beds to come into a work environment that I've created. So now
Mhm.
I help other organizations create healthy working environments for their service providers. And I also help service providers learn ways to, regulate their emotions in the workplace so that they can remain healthy, happy, and whole. So they
Yeah.
can, work and still remain them.
Yeah. I'm curious, from an educational standpoint, what did you find, and if you can't summarize as much as you
Mhm.
can, one of the key things that you found was challenging or creating challenge around the work environment?
Mm. Unfulfilled people.
Mm.
Unfulfilled people. I never saw as many tears
Mhm.
in my life as I saw during that year that I worked as a teacher. Perhaps those same tears occurred when I taught before, but I was in my 20s, so I wasn't having conversations with teachers who were in their 40s. I was having conversations with teachers who were in their 30s, actually. I started teaching at 22 years old and I was out by 29. So now I'm looking. So when I was teaching, my ex-husband used to say that, you were never tired because your job was to go to work and date somebody. Literally, when I worked, that's what I did. I went to work, I was done by 2, and then I partied. That was life. Whereas now, going back in, I was older, I was in my 40s. So I was having different conversations. So now I'm talking to people who, are single and they're mothers and they're their child is somewhere doing something. They're here, they're trying to split, their time between. They have to call in if they have to do a doctor's appointment. There are people who are seeing people who they feel have, less aptitude than they have, moving ahead of them faster. So a lot
Mhm.
of people feel stuck.
Yeah.
And when you feel stuck, and then there are other areas of your life that, may not be working the way you want them to work, and you have to come into a building and engage with other people who might be feeling some of that same things. It's a lot of things in the room.
Yeah.
And then when you add in the lack of autonomy, I think, when you have a profession, one of the things about a profession, I think that what differs a profession from a job is that opportunity to reflect and grow. Because when I think of a job, I think of a series of duties. When
Mhm.
I think of a profession, I think of a mission. and I have to go somewhere and I have to think about the mission to move it forward.
Mm.
And in teaching, I think that many of them were being treated as though teaching was a job. They had a list of duties. So with that, you don't have the opportunity to think about your practice, think about the things that work, the things that don't work, the thing, how does it work with your personality? They're working on pacing guides. And so with that, I think there were a lot of very gifted and talented people who felt stuck.
Yeah.
And when people don't, when they aren't rewarded and acknowledged as they should, they find other ways to build hierarchies within their organization, and
Mhm.
that comes unhealthy.
Mhm. I think you summarized that very, very well. It was a very, very elegant way to summarize it. I don't think I would have been able to summarize it quite as delicately, but I definitely think that what you're saying makes a lot of sense, and even to the point of autonomy is something. I'm not directly in the education space. Product to educators, but
Mhm,
when I think about even just what I understand of, granted varies state by state, but even
mhm.
thinking about Florida and some of the, restrictions and just the way that, education has shifted and sort of the
Oh, it's very
goals
different.
and all of and then
Mhm.
the way that teachers are forced to teach, it's definitely concerning, right? In terms of why would people want to then go into a profession to then be forced to teach things, or even people that look like you and me forced not to be able to have honest conversations about things that happened and occurred, and have these sort of not be able to share their experiences by way of, the tools and resources that they're using to educate
Right,
uh, children who look like them too.
that part.
Yeah. So there's definitely just a lot in that space to unpack.